Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 Sonic Youth minus Thirst and More fan, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Kim Gordon record, The Collective. Look, this channel isn't trying to dictate your opinion on anything. I made this channel because I want to show some people music that they may not have heard of, that they may have missed, while also maybe encouraging some people to think more critically about why they like the stuff that they like. However, one objective fact is that Kim Gordon is one of the coolest human beings to ever walk this planet, and anyone who dismisses her contributions to music, either solo at this point or with her iconic band, Sonic Youth, is a source to never be trusted, honestly. After the rough disbandment of her former band in 2011, Kim Gordon finally made her solo debut with 2019's No Home record, a very good, highly experimental, electronic forward album that did have some hints at what was to come on The Collective, but was certainly its own beast in its own right, and definitely a album that I recommend personally, even if it is sometimes a bit contentious depending on which part of the Sonic Youth fanbase that you happen to be in. Besides just being a strong sophomore studio album for an absolute legend of alternative music, The Collective also acts as one of the most shocking and baffling creative directions that any notable veteran of the music industry has gone in recent memory. I mean, don't get me wrong, this album still makes sense for it being a Kim Gordon record, but when you place this into the context of musicians who have been performing for decades, musicians that are now in their 70s, this kind of album is practically unheard of unless it's Black Star by David Bowie, maybe. Even by the extremely adventurous nature and context and standards of Kim Gordon's overall sound, this is something else entirely. Look, I'm not saying I'm absolutely in love with this album, it's flawed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but if you can't tell, I'm a little bit baffled by this one. The most immediately notable aspect of The Collective in terms of new, interesting, shiny things in the context of Kim Gordon's discography is how many influences it embraces from the modern day experimental rap scene, primarily those experimental rappers that are starting to hit more of the mainstream. And that is a sentence that I never thought I would say talking about a Kim Gordon album. These influences are made extremely obvious the second that the album opens up with its lead single, Bye Bye, with this super dense, heavy instrumental that sounds right out of the next drop from an Opium label artist like Playboi Carti, for example. Those really pounding instrumentals, the heavy bass, the aggressively distorted synths that are incredibly industrial in nature. It feels like something entirely modern and something entirely not Kim Gordon in concept. But in terms of execution, she completely makes it her own. I mean, if you couldn't tell by my description already, The Collective is Kim Gordon once again remolding her sound in a way that is entirely hers, while still taking inspiration from a variety of different places, maintaining her same degree of coolness that she's had since she started existing. I guess this woman has never stopped being cool, and it takes a lot of influences from a lot of modern, like I said, experimental rappers, artists like Yeat of all artists, for example, but at the same time it doesn't feel like an aging experimentalist trying to keep up with the times or anything like that. I don't really think that Kim Gordon is capable of coming across that way. I mean, she is the times, I'm pretty sure. Gordon takes a lot of these genres, ideas, influences that have developed themselves within the world of music over the course of the past, say, 5, 10 years or so, and turns them into something that feels significantly more decayed than what you would normally expect to get out of stuff relating to trap and rage right now. I mean, this feels like a deconstruction and reconstruction of both of those genres to the point that the record in and of itself doesn't necessarily feel related to either of those. I mean, don't get me wrong, the influences from the realm of trap and rage specifically within the entire world of experimental hip-hop are very much here. They're very prominent. They, in a way, define a huge chunk of the album. But at the same time, it doesn't feel particularly obvious because Kim Gordon is turning things into a much more apocalyptic format than you would get on, say, a Ken Carson record. Now, with all of that being said, there are still a lot of hallmarks of Rage in particular to be found on this record. A lot of things like the auto-tuned freeform vocals on the somewhat shoegaze-tinged psychedelic orgasm, a really great track and another single from the record, or the more percussion-forward mindset of tracks like I Don't Miss My Mind and the, again, heavy percussion, heavy bass behind them. It's a record that takes direct inspiration from a variety of different sources that are fairly obvious to people who are in the know about those kinds of artists, and considering artists like Ye and Playboi Carti are some of the most iconic rappers on the planet right now, that's the majority of the public under the age of 30. But nonetheless, it does genuinely feel like Kim Gordon is doing her own thing with these sounds and still embracing a lot of modern style that keeps her feeling fresh, and at the same time taking that modern style and turning it into something that feels genuine and not just some sort of mildly interesting take on sounds that you've heard before. This feels like a unique record, and I can say that pretty firmly. I think in a way you could attribute at least part of this sound to the primary producer of the record, Justin Raisin, who is an individual who has worked with a number of extremely popular and probably future iconic artists of the current period. You have artists that he's worked with ranging from Lil Yachty and Eve Toomer to Charlie XCX and Sky Ferreira, among a number of other people. He even worked with Ariel Pink, which, well, they can't all be winners. I digress. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the collective doesn't feel derivative of a specific artist or specific scene, and even if you could argue that it is slightly derivative of a specific style, I don't really think that's a totally valid argument to make here. I mean, there is not the youthful energy that you would get from some of the recent Playboi Carti singles, or a record like Ken Carson's A Great Chaos from last year. This is Kim Gordon doing her own thing with her own presence, her own personality, and her own very experimental art punk kind of take on a variety of different sounds that I don't think anyone would have expected to, really exist 30 years ago. It certainly does help that there are a lot of more traditional artsy art rock kind of moments going on here throughout the record that feel more directly part of the trademark sound that she's been producing over the course of both her solo career up to this point as well as her stint with Sonic Youth over the course of multiple decades. And much of these sounds here, interestingly, kind of present themselves in a way that I would say is actually more adjacent to Sonic Youth's earliest work. I'm talking pre-Daydream Nation kind of stuff. Very no-wave and a heavy punk influence that we haven't gotten from a Kim Gordon-involved project in a long while. The collective often rejects the standard notions of melodies or choruses or hooks or anything like that for the sake of texturing and the repetition of certain lines to really make a point about something, or maybe the repetition of a certain instrumental to have it drone on and really hypnotize the listener, etc., etc. You have tracks like It's Dark Inside that demonstrates this menacing, deep atmosphere that feels almost ready to collapse in on itself at any given moment, and allows it to stand as a pretty major highlight throughout the entirety of the record. And that isn't to mention the album closer, Dream Dollar, which closes things out with a very art punk, verging on dance punk kind of vibe that I think is super interesting to hear from her, as the majority of this record is the definition of slow burn. Elsewhere, you have tracks like Shelf Warmer that really subtly incorporate a lot of industrial influences into their more rock-oriented sound, with the aforementioned track transitioning really brilliantly into the harsh noise opening of The Believers, which is one of my favorite moments on the entire record, though I think that more has to do with my love for noise music than it does anything else. Many of these tracks, many passages within these tracks are still well rooted within experimental rock at large, which allows the collective to not feel entirely un-Kim Gordon, if you will, and that brings up a certain point where some people might say that that's Kim Gordon not going down enough of a creative avenue, not dedicating herself to some of the more out there and bizarre decisions that she makes here artistically, but for what it's worth, I think that it allows the qualities of some of her best works to shine through here. Now, with all of that being said, I still do think that The Collective is a record with some legitimate flaws that prevent it from being a totally successful experiment, or at least an experiment that is consistently successful. Some of the best moments here are easily the best work that Kim Gordon has produced in her entire solo career so far, but some of the weaker moments here are exactly that, weaker. My biggest gripe with this record is that despite her deadpan vocals sounding as great and filled with personality as ever, a lot of the lyrical content here, and at least a solid chunk of the lyrical and songwriting content, is questionable at times. For example, the previously mentioned Bye Bye is instrumentally a great track. She sounds fantastic on it, but the lyrics just being Kim Gordon listing off various different items to buy is a novelty that kind of wears off after repeated listens, and it kind of makes me wish there was at least a touch more substance going on in that track, and that's not to mention a couple of other songs that feel awkwardly executed overall, like Trophies, the second shortest song on the record, where bowling is a recurring theme throughout it, and it's being used as this sort of vague and oddly executed metaphor that doesn't have nearly as much impact as I think was intended. But as a whole, the songwriting here is mostly fine. Plus, you do have a couple of tracks like I'm a Man that actually are written extremely well. The entire atmosphere of the record can feel maybe a little bit stagnant at times as well, mainly due to the fact that the collective is primarily made up of a fairly singular sonic style, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It allows the record to come across as cohesive, as a singular piece that's worth listening to from front to back each time that you want to revisit it, which is something that I'm sure I will be doing in the future at some point or another. But at the same time, it does mean that repeated listens can maybe get a little bit grating, that things can feel a bit one note if you aren't directly paying attention to a lot of the embellishments and nuances going on under the initial layers of each song, so on and so forth. It's not necessarily to say that the atmosphere here is poorly executed. This is a beautifully textured record. It's just that it can become a little bit singular if you aren't really putting your focus into it. But then again, you could also argue that's the intention of the record in the first place. Now, firstly, I do want to say that some of the denser-than-normal moments, such as the aforementioned The Believers, are a few passages throughout the record that really manage to stand out and break things up. It goes from dense to very dense. It goes from loud to very loud, etc., etc. You get my point. And as a whole, I don't necessarily think these traits are album ruiners. They don't make the listening experience bad because, no, the songwriting on this track isn't really up to par or whatever. I just do think that the album would have been better if certain things had been executed a little bit more smoothly, but as a whole, this is already an album that's supposed to feel like it's kind of industrialized and heavily modern, yet at the same time falling apart, and I think that it achieves that, albeit unintentionally, via some of the awkward moments here. Look, there's a few moments on the record that I just don't think are as smoothly executed as some other moments are, and you know what, that's fine in the grand scheme of things. It does make for a slight lack in consistency of quality, but as a whole, I don't think it really tears down this album or anything. The Collective may not be a perfect record, and you could even go as far as to argue that it isn't the super off-kilter experimental project that the singles initially implied it to be, with a lot of songs here feeling pretty rooted in what Kim Gordon has always been known for, making very noisy alternative music within the realm of rock, but never really being classifiable as just plain rock. But that being said, this still acts as a great bit of evidence that Kim Gordon is still willing to evolve, toy with her own sound, morph into various other versions of herself, and that she's better off for it. I'm not sure how aware you are of this, but the average 70-year-old is now here putting out records that combine a lot of mainstream experimental rap with noise rock, with spoken word stuff, with a lot of stuff. Okay, man? And I have to say that throughout the Collective, she sounds artistically rejuvenated, not that she ever lost her spark or anything like that, and she brings to the table a new sound that she's never really experimented with before, at least not exactly to the extent that she does here, without really deviating from her noisy rock roots that made her such an icon in the first place literal decades ago. While I wouldn't say that it stacks up as one of the best projects that Kim Gordon has ever been involved with, I do think that The Collective is a must-hear for 2024 based on sheer personality alone, or at the very least a record that I highly recommend if you want something that is deeply unique and entirely its own stylistically. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.